Time inside Lawrence Prison had a rhythm of its own. The days bled into one another, indistinguishable from the one before, with only the clang of the gates, the hollow echo of guards' boots on the cement, and the occasional stir of conflict to break the monotony. Ethan Carter had spent 2 years behind these walls, his existence confined to a cell with peeling paint and an iron bed that seemed to serve as little more than a reminder of his permanent incarceration. Each day, he followed the routine: meals in the mess hall, yard time in an overcrowded patch of concrete, and evenings spent in his cramped cell with nothing but his thoughts, the sound of distant laughter, and the occasional shout to keep him company. In a place where isolation was the cruelest form of punishment, the idea of an outreach program was laughable. The prison administration had no real interest in reform. It was all a smokescreen. But the social worker, a well-meaning woman named Claire, kept pushing. She handed Ethan a form, her fingers tapping lightly on the paper, as if it were the answer to his internal despair. Fill it out. You never know. Someone out there might want to write to you. It could be good for you, she suggested. Ethan, with a slow, almost reluctant exhale, scrawled his name on the form. He had nothing to lose, but the idea of writing to a stranger felt pointless. He didn't believe that anyone, much less someone who didn't even know him, would want to know him. He had a reputation in the prison for his robbery conviction, and no one outside cared to reach out to men like him. So he filled out the form half-heartedly, his mind already elsewhere. Weeks passed. Ethan thought little of the form until one gray morning, when a plain white envelope arrived in the mailroom, addressed to him in neat handwriting. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, just another piece of mundane correspondence. But the name on the return address caught his attention. Sophia. He didn't know anyone named Sophia, not on the outside, at least. She was a complete stranger, yet as he tore open the envelope, something about the letter seemed different. It wasn't the usual code, formalities he was used to receiving from lawyers or even family members. This letter was personal, warm, even, and as he read the opening lines, something unexpected stirred within him. I chose you randomly from a list, but I believe there are no accidents. Maybe we both need someone to talk to. I'm a little lonely in this huge city, too. The words hit him harder than he expected. He found himself staring at the letter for a long time. It wasn't much. A brief introduction, a few polite questions about life in prison, a vague hope for connection, but it carried a sincerity that was rare, almost strange in a place like Lawrence. Ethan had spent so many months surrounded by hardened criminals, each more concerned with survival than with the ideas of kindness or vulnerability. And here, someone was reaching out to him. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next major crime stories. The days that followed saw Ethan staring at the letter repeatedly, considering how best to respond. He didn't know what he was supposed to say to a woman who knew nothing about him. He was a man behind bars, someone condemned not just by the law, but by his own actions. His vocabulary had long been limited to slang and prison jargon, words that were heavy with cynicism and disillusionment. But for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he spent that night writing his response. Each sentence was carefully considered, carefully crafted. He wrote, "Thank you for your letter. I didn't expect anyone to write. Time drags here like a rubber band, and any news from the outside is like a breath of fresh air." The next few lines softened. He spoke about his life, his past before prison, and how he missed the simple things, like the sound of rain, the smell of coffee brewing. As he wrote, he felt something shift within him. The formal tone of the beginning started to slip away, and by the time he signed his name, he realized he was writing more than he had intended. This was no longer just a response. It was a confession. Sophia's reply arrived, and with it, the small spark of hope that Ethan hadn't realized he'd been missing. Her letters became a regular occurrence. She was patient, kind, and gentle in a way he hadn't experienced in years. She shared snippets of her life, the work she did as a graphic designer, the quiet afternoons spent in her small apartment overlooking a park, the books she was reading, And as Ethan learned more about her, he found himself sharing things he had never told anyone. Dreams, memories, fears, and even regrets. She listened, not with judgment, but with empathy. And so, their correspondence deepened. Letters turned into intimate conversations about the future, about what they both wanted from life. In his letters, Ethan felt like someone who could still have a future, someone who wasn't defined by the concrete walls around him. He found himself waiting for her letters the way a man waits for his last meal before a long hunger. Every word she wrote was a lifeline. As spring arrived, their letters became more personal, filled with confessions of longing and hope. Ethan shared his dreams for after his release, an old lake house, perhaps a small garden where they could grow flowers. Sophia, in turn, shared her fears, the fears of someone who had been hiding a part of herself for years. She confessed timidly, "Sometimes I'm afraid that when we meet, something will change, that you'll see the real me and be disappointed." Ethan couldn't understand why she would think that. To him, she had already become more real than anything he had left behind in the prison. More real than the cold concrete walls, more real than the bars that divided him from the world. His response was simple but heartfelt. "You're the only thing keeping me afloat here. Without your letters, I don't think I'd survive." The bond between them only grew stronger. By the time summer rolled around, Ethan was doing something he never thought possible. He proposed to her in a letter. He rewrote it 7 times before he could muster the courage to send it. He wasn't asking for a grand wedding or some traditional ceremony. What he wanted, what he needed, was a promise of a future. And so he asked, "Will you marry me? I know it sounds crazy. I'm here and you're there, but I need to know we have something to look forward to, that we have a future." 2 weeks passed in a slow, agonizing stretch of time, and when the response arrived, Ethan's hand shook as he opened the letter. Inside was a silver ring on a chain, and the words he had longed to hear. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I'll wait for you as long as it takes." The simplicity of it was all he needed. Their marriage wasn't traditional, no ceremony, no vows exchanged in front of friends and family. It was a paperwork-only affair, but to Ethan, it felt more real than any wedding could ever be. He was married, and the thought that someone out there, someone real, loved him, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Their letters grew even more intimate after that. They spoke of their first meeting, of the things they would do when he was finally released. And as Ethan's release date came closer, the fantasy of holding Sophia, of touching her, of finally being free, became something he lived for. His cellmates teased him, asking if she was really as beautiful as he made her out to be. Ethan would smile, but he was never bothered by their questions. He knew what he had. He knew he had something no one else in that prison could even imagine. But as the day of their first meeting drew closer, something in Sophia's letters began to change. Her tone became more hesitant. She spoke less of their future together and more of her fears. Fears that seemed to grow with every passing day. She spoke of not being ready, of not knowing how to meet him in person after everything they had shared. And for the first time, Ethan felt the stirrings of doubt. Why would she hesitate? After all, they had shared everything with each other in their letters. Wasn't that enough? Sophia's reluctance grew, but she agreed eventually to come see him. She promised to meet him on the first Saturday in October. Ethan, however, wasn't sure what to make of her fears. He had lived inside the prison walls for so long, and the life he had built in his mind with Sophia had become the one thing that kept him from losing himself entirely. She had become his salvation, the symbol of everything he dreamed of. She was the person who had pulled him from the edge of despair. And now, as the moment of their meeting approached, the anticipation was unbearable. The weeks leading up to the first Saturday in October felt like an eternity. Inside the concrete walls of Lawrence Prison, time always crawled, but now it felt as though it had come to a complete standstill. Ethan Carter's every waking moment was consumed by one singular thought: meeting Sophia. The excitement, the anticipation, the idea of finally touching her, seeing her, hearing her voice, These dreams had become his entire world. He lived for the letters that arrived each week, savoring each word, each line, as if they held the key to his future. And now, that future was just within reach. It was almost too much to believe. He spent his days counting down the hours. Every morning, he woke to the harsh clang of the cell doors and the sharp voice of the warden barking orders, but it no longer had the same impact on him. The prison's usual monotony faded into the background of his mind. Instead, his thoughts were consumed by the upcoming meeting. His cellmates, noticing his unusual silence, teased him mercilessly. "You're looking like a man on a mission, Carter. Got a hot date or something?" Kevin Harding, his cellmate, chuckled from his top bunk, watching Ethan as he meticulously groomed himself in front of the small mirror. Ethan's hands moved through his hair with practiced care, smoothing it back as best as he could. He had done this at least 3 times that morning. "Not a date," Ethan replied quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the words. "It's my wife. She's coming to visit." Kevin's eyes widened in mock surprise. "Your wife, huh? I gotta say, I didn't expect that. A woman coming to visit a guy like you? You sure she knows what she's getting into?" Ethan ignored him, his mind far from the prison banter. This was different. Sophia was different. This wasn't some fleeting prison fantasy or a desperate attempt for physical release. This was real. Something he'd been waiting for since the first letter had arrived. And she had promised him something more than just a visit. She had promised that when they finally met, their connection, the love they shared through their letters, would be just as real in person. Still, despite his belief, the nerves began to settle in his stomach. There was an edge to the excitement, a gnawing uncertainty that tugged at him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Why hadn't she been more enthusiastic about the visit? She had agreed, yes, but her letters lately carried an air of hesitation. She spoke of how nervous she was, how unsure she felt. Was it because of him? Had he done something wrong? Was a love they shared only an illusion, a dream built upon false pretenses? He shoved the thoughts down each time they surfaced, but they lingered, like an unwelcome guest at the back of his mind. The day of the visit arrived with the same cold efficiency that everything in prison seemed to carry. Ethan woke before dawn as usual, but this morning felt different. There was a heightened energy to everything. He dressed quickly in his prison-issued uniform, smoothing the wrinkles, though he knew it didn't matter. It was the anticipation, not the appearance, that consumed him. He stood in front of the small mirror in his cell, adjusting his hair one last time, and checked the time again. Only an hour left. His hands were trembling slightly, and he hated himself for it. What was he afraid of? Why was he nervous? He had nothing to fear. He had waited 17 months for this moment. His cellmates, including Kevin, began to notice his palpable tension, exchanging knowing glances. Kevin's grin widened, though it lacked the usual teasing edge. "Man, you're really going to make us all jealous today, aren't you? Can't wait to hear the details." Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he stood still, staring at the photograph of Sophia that he had taped to his wall. He had kept it there for months, studying it every night before he fell asleep. It was the only piece of her he had, a poor imitation of the woman he had built in his mind. The picture was a little blurry, taken at some event, probably a holiday party. But there was something about her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, that captivated him. He traced his fingers over the photograph, the thin paper now slightly worn at the edges. His thoughts were interrupted by the call for breakfast. The usual clamor of inmates filled the air as they shuffled toward the mess hall, but Ethan remained standing, lost in his thoughts. He hadn't eaten much in the past few days. The hunger he felt now wasn't for food. It was for something else entirely. Sophia. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the time arrived. A guard came to his cell and motioned for him to stand. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he was led through the maze of hallways to the visiting room. His footsteps echoed loudly in the sterile, silent corridors, the weight of the building's oppressive walls pressing in on him. He tried to calm his mind, telling himself that this would be the moment he had dreamed of. But as they approached the visitation room, a knot of unease settled in his stomach. His excitement began to mix with something else, something darker, more unsettling. What if it wasn't what he imagined? What if the woman who walked through those doors wasn't the one he had come to love through their letters? What if the dreams he'd held on to for so long unraveled before his eyes? Sophia had seemed so certain when they first wrote to each other. She had spoken of their future together with unwavering conviction. Yet, her last few letters hinted at something more. There had been a distance in her words, a tremor of fear that hadn't been there before. He pushed it all aside. He wouldn't let these doubts ruin this moment. He had built a life in his mind around her, around this meeting. It was all he had left. The door to the visiting room swung open, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He could see her standing there, just inside the threshold. His Sophia, the woman who had pulled him through the darkest moments of his life. She stood still for a moment, her face pale, but her eyes locked onto his. And in that moment, Ethan was certain there was no one else in the world. Nothing else mattered. She was exactly as he had imagined, and yet not at all. Sophia was taller than he'd expected, her frame slender and delicate. The soft brown hair she had described in her letters fell just below her shoulders, a few strands loosely framing her face. Her eyes were the same eyes he had memorized from the picture, the same sparkle, the same warmth. But there was something else, a tension, a sadness behind those eyes that he hadn't seen before. It was as if the woman he had built in his mind had cracked, revealing something much more fragile beneath. Ethan stepped forward, his heart racing as he reached out for her, desperate to close the distance between them. He had dreamed of this moment, of holding her, touching her, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. He reached for her shoulders, and for a moment, all his fears faded away. It was her. She was real. Sophia stepped into his embrace, her body warm against his. The scent of her perfume, light and floral, filled his senses. She was trembling, but he couldn't tell if it was from nerves or something else. He pulled her closer, feeling the tightness in her body as she hesitated. "I can't believe this is real," he whispered into her hair. "You're here." Sophia didn't respond at first. She seemed to relax into his arms for just a second, but then she pulled back slightly, her face serious, her eyes filled with something unreadable. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, her voice low and trembling. He frowned, confused by the sudden shift in her demeanor. Wasn't this supposed to be the happiest moment of their lives? The culmination of everything they'd shared through their letters? He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not exactly who you think I am." Ethan blinked, his heart stuttering in his chest. Her words felt like a blow to the gut. What was she saying? He pulled back slightly, looking at her face more closely, trying to understand the gravity of what she was implying. But the confusion was instant, overwhelming. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Sophia, what are you talking about?" Sophia took a deep breath, her hand shaking as she reached for his. "There's something I've been hiding from you, something I should have told you before." Her eyes were full of an emotion he couldn't place. Fear, regret, vulnerability. Ethan's mind raced, but he couldn't grasp what was happening. His hands tightened around hers. "Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. You're here, and that's all that matters." But Sophia shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "It does matter, Ethan," she whispered. "It matters a lot." The moment hung between them, heavy and thick with the weight of unspoken truths. And then, in the stillness of the visiting room, with the distant hum of the prison in the background, she finally said the words that would change everything. "I'm transgender, Ethan. I was born in a man's body." For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to stop. Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. The world around him spun, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He searched her face, but all he saw was the same woman. the woman he had dreamed of, the woman he had loved. But now, a horrible confusion twisted his stomach. "What are you saying?" he whispered, the words barely leaving his lips. "I don't understand." Sophia's expression faltered, and the tears that had threatened to spill finally broke free. "I didn't know how to tell you, Ethan. I've been on hormone therapy for years. I've had surgery. I'm not who you thought I was." The silence in the room was deafening. It stretched on, thicker than the oppressive walls that surrounded them, holding both Ethan and Sophia captive in its suffocating grasp. Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "I'm transgender. I was born in a man's body." For a moment, Ethan's mind refused to process what she had said. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had spent months falling in love with through letters, the woman he had dreamed of touching, kissing, and holding, with the words she had just spoken. Sophia's tear-streaked face was a mirror of the anguish she had been carrying for so long. She trembled as if waiting for the impact of her confession to land, but the tension between them only grew. Ethan's grip on her hands tightened, and his heart raced, a mix of confusion and something darker clawing its way to the surface. For the briefest of moments, he couldn't speak. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, his mind scrambling to process the reality of what she had just revealed. The woman standing before him, the one he had fallen in love with, the one he had counted down the days to meet, now felt like a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. You're telling me that you're a man?" Ethan's voice cracked, betraying the disbelief he was feeling. His words sounded foreign even to him, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes searched her face for something, anything, that would confirm that this was some kind of mistake, a cruel joke, maybe, but all he saw in her eyes was pain, a pain that mirrored his own. Sophia swallowed hard, her lips quivering as she took a step back, her body withdrawing from him as if the truth had created a chasm between them that she couldn't cross. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice trembling, barely a whisper. "I never meant to lie to you, Ethan. Everything I've shared with you, it was real. I've never felt more understood, more loved than when I'm with you. But I had to tell you the truth. I just couldn't keep hiding it." Ethan's mind was reeling. The woman he had fallen for, the woman who had become his salvation, was telling him that everything he thought he knew about her was a lie. His thoughts collided with each other in chaotic bursts. "She's lying. This can't be real. She's not a man. She's not my Sophia. Not the woman I've dreamed of." But the silence between them grew heavier, pressing in on him. He could feel the weight of her confession in the pit of his stomach. The reality of what she was saying hit him with full force, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. "She's not who I thought she was." That thought echoed through his mind, over and over again, each repetition driving him further into panic. Sophia stood a few feet, away from him now, her eyes not meeting his, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked small, fragile, as though the very act to reveal herself had drained all her strength. And yet, there was a quiet courage in the way she held herself. She was still the same woman, Ethan thought, the woman I loved, the woman I dreamed of, but was this what he had truly wanted? Or had he built her up to be something she was not? Someone who existed only in the confines of his imagination? "Why didn't you tell me before?" The question slipped from Ethan's lips before he could stop it. His voice was raw, filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Why hide this from me? Why make me fall in love with someone I can't even touch? Someone who's not real?" Sophia's eyes finally met his, and the pain in them was unbearable. "Because I was afraid," she said, her voice a quiet confession, heavy with regret. "I was afraid you wouldn't love me if you knew. I thought maybe we could have something real, even if it was just through letters. But I knew this day would come. I knew I couldn't keep hiding it from you. I love you, Ethan. I never wanted to hurt you." Ethan's breath hitched in his chest. "I love you too," he wanted to say, but the words felt like they would choke him. His emotions were a whirlwind. Fear, confusion, anger, and an inexplicable sense of betrayal. He had imagined this moment for months. He had fantasized about holding her. kissing her, feeling her skin against his. He had dreamed of their future, a future where they would be together. But now, all of those dreams were being shattered in an instant. How could he have been so blind? Why didn't I see it? Why didn't she tell me? He took a step forward, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. Why didn't you tell me in the beginning? From the start, when we first started writing. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but the hurt was palpable. Why wait until now? Why wait until we're standing here, face to face, and I'm already in love with you? Before we proceed, kindly hit the subscribe button for more videos like this. Sophia shook her head slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. Because I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want you to think of me as something less than what I am. I didn't want you to look at me differently. Her voice broke, and a single tear slid down her cheek. I didn't want you to hate me. Hate. The word struck Ethan like a physical blow. He had never even considered that possibility, that he could hate her. How could I hate her? And yet, as the words hung between them, a bitter taste rose in his mouth, the remnants of something dark he couldn't quite name. His confusion and pain were being replaced with a new feeling, something he hadn't anticipated. Is this what betrayal feels like? Sophia was trembling now, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as though she were trying to hold herself together. The distance between them seemed to stretch farther and farther, and Ethan could feel the wall between them growing thicker with each passing second. I never lied to you about how I felt, she continued, her voice desperate. Every word I wrote to you, everything I said, I meant it. I love you, Ethan. I loved you before you even knew the truth. And I still love you now. She took a shaky step toward him, her hands reaching out as if trying to bridge the distance between them. Please understand. I didn't want to hurt you. Ethan recoiled. The sudden movement caught Sophia off guard, and she froze, her hands falling to her sides, her face drained of color. The look in his eyes was colder now, a mixture of confusion and something darker, something he couldn't control. You think I'm supposed to just understand? His voice was rising now, the anger he'd been suppressing for so long finally breaking through. How the hell am I supposed to understand this, Sophia? How am I supposed to understand why you didn't tell me before? Why you kept hiding this from me when I was out here dreaming of a life with you? Sophia flinched as if his words physically struck her. Her eyes filled with pain as she took a step back, her hand instinctively covering her chest. I never wanted to deceive you, Ethan. I never wanted to hurt you, but I'm still the same person. I still love you. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest. The words I love you echoed in his mind, but they no longer felt like they belonged to the same person. Who was this woman standing before him now? How could she be the same woman he had written to for months, the woman who had shared her hopes and dreams with him? And yet she still was. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on him. The questions, the uncertainty, it was all too much. His mind spiraled, and the world seemed to blur around him. He wanted to yell, to lash out, to somehow make sense of the chaos in his chest. But instead, he stood there, his mouth dry, unable to speak. Sophia seemed to shrink under the weight of his silence, her expression becoming one of defeat. The hope that had lit her face when she first arrived had slowly been replaced by resignation. She had been prepared for rejection. She had been prepared for the pain that might come with revealing the truth. But this cold silence, was something she hadn't anticipated. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. Instead, he turned away from her, his back facing her as he stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. He was lost, trapped in a maelstrom of emotions he didn't know how to handle. His dreams, his future, his love. Everything he had imagined was slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't stop it. In that moment, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The woman who had once been his salvation, the woman he had pinned all his hopes on, was now a stranger to him, and he had no idea what to do with that. The silence between them stretched long and suffocating, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't the kind of silence that carried understanding, the kind where two people could find peace in each other's presence. This silence was full of tension, of hurt, and of a truth neither of them were prepared for. Ethan's mind raced, his heart pounding, as the reality of what Sophia had told him sank deeper into his bones. He felt a fire building in his chest, a heat that surged with every breath. This can't be happening. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, fantasized about the life they would build together once he was free from these walls. And now, the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with his deepest thoughts, his darkest fears, had shattered everything. She had betrayed him in the one way he had never expected. Sophia stood a few steps away from him, her eyes brimming with tears. The remorse in her gaze was undeniable, but it wasn't enough to quell the storm that was raging inside Ethan. He had imagined her arrival with such anticipation, such longing. The truth was supposed to set them free, to bring them together, not break them apart. He had never once imagined that this truth would be the reason everything fell apart. You think I can just understand this, Sophia? His voice rose, sharp and cutting, as if the words had taken on a life of their own. You think I can just forget everything, accept it like it's nothing? Sophia's face twisted in anguish, her hands trembling at her sides as if she were bracing for an impact. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The look in her eyes was one of desperation, as if she were trying to find the right thing to say. But there was nothing left to say. Ethan had already made up his mind. The dam of emotions he'd been holding back for so long began to break apart, flooding the room with anger, betrayal, and disbelief. You think I'm just supposed to look at you the same? Ethan spat, his fists clenching at his sides. After everything you told me? After everything I've been through? His voice trembled with fury now, the magnitude of the betrayal crashing over him. I'm a man in here, Sophia. I've been alone for so long, and you... He gestured wildly, his hand cutting through the air as if he could cut through the pain, the hurt. You've been lying to me all these months, all those letters, all those promises. You lied to me. Sophia's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling in quick succession as she backed away from him. Ethan, please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I never lied about how I felt. Everything I said to you, I meant it. I love you. This doesn't change anything. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, the sound twisted with disgust. You think I don't see it now? His words were venomous, the anger boiling over. You're not the woman I thought you were. You're not a woman. You're a lie. His voice trembled, but there was no remorse in it, only searing rage. Sophia took a step back, her eyes wide, the words like a physical blow. She had prepared for many things, rejection, anger, hurt, but not this, not the fury she saw in Ethan's face. She had expected him to be hurt, to be confused, but not like this, not this kind of rage. And suddenly, she realized with a sickening clarity just how much this moment had changed everything. You don't understand, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to. Shut up. Ethan roared, his hands reaching out, his frustration building to an uncontrollable peak. The words felt like they had a life of their own, pushing him further into a place he couldn't escape. Shut up, Sophia. You don't get it. You've ruined everything. His heart pounded in his chest, his entire body trembling with the intensity of his emotions. He wanted to scream, to hit something, to do something that would rid him of this burning pain inside. Every inch of him wanted to lash out, to take back the illusion of the perfect life he had built in his mind. How could she do this to me? Sophia flinched, her arms instinctively crossing over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from his words. Her eyes flickered with confusion and fear, and she tried to speak again, but the words caught in her throat. The prison walls, once a symbol of Ethan's confinement, now seemed to close in on both of them. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension, as though every breath was a struggle. You think this is easy for me? She finally whispered, her voice breaking. Do you think I wanted to be born this way? Do you think I wanted to hide this from you? Do you think I wanted to hurt you like this? Her plea seemed to fall on deaf ears. Ethan was no longer the man who had written her letters, who had poured out his heart in fragile ink on paper. He was a man consumed by something darker, something primal. He was lost in his rage, in his overwhelming sense of betrayal, and in the suffocating realization that the woman he loved, the woman he had dreamed of, was gone. And as she stood there, helpless and broken, something inside him snapped. With a primal scream, Ethan lunged forward, his hands reaching for her. The raw power of his emotions overtook him, and he wasn't thinking. He didn't want to think. He just wanted to stop the pain, stop the betrayal, stop the crushing weight of the lies he had been fed. His hands grabbed onto her shoulders, pushing her back toward the bed. The cold, unyielding violence of the moment overwhelmed everything else, his dreams, his love, his future. Sophia's body hit the bed with a soft thud, and she gasped, her hands instinctively reaching out for him. Ethan, please stop. I love you. She could barely get the words out between her sobs. But it was too late. Ethan's mind had already shut down. All he could see was red. All he could feel was a searing rage, the gut-wrenching betrayal that flooded his chest. He shook her roughly, his hands tightening on her arms as he pressed her down onto bed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. You lied to me, he hissed through gritted teeth. You lied to me, and now you'll pay for it. Sophia struggled beneath him, her body tense as she tried to push him off, but his strength was too much. She could feel his fingers digging into her wrists, the harshness of his grip, sending waves of panic through her. Ethan, please, she cried, her voice breaking. I'm still the same person. Please don't do this. But Ethan was beyond reason. His rage was a beast he could no longer control. The words she spoke only fueled it, deepening his anger, feeding the monster that had taken root inside him. His hands found her throat, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The love they had shared, the plans they had made, it all vanished, drowned out by the noise of his fury. Sophia's gasp became weaker as she clawed at his hands, her vision blurring, the world spinning around her. She tried to speak, tried to reach him, but the words never came. The air was thinning, her chest burning as she struggled to breathe. The seconds dragged on, stretched out in a cruel, distorted eternity. Sophia's body went limp, her hands falling to her sides as she lost the strength to fight back. Her eyes, wide with shock and pain, stared up at Ethan, who was still straddling her, his expression vacant, consumed by something far darker than he had ever imagined. When it was over, the room was filled with an eerie stillness. Ethan sat back, his hands trembling as they hovered over her lifeless body. His breath was ragged, his pulse pounding in his ears. For a long moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak. The reality of what he had done, what he had taken from her, slowly began to seep into his consciousness. His heart hammered in his chest, but it was no longer from anger. Now, it was from a deep, crippling regret, an overwhelming wave of horror. He stared at Sophia's body, her eyes still open, her lips parted in a final, silent plea that he couldn't erase from his mind. The silence of the room was unbearable now, thick and suffocating. He had killed her. The woman he loved, the woman he had promised a future, was gone. The weight of his actions slammed into him like a tidal wave, and for the first time, he understood the irreversible nature of what he had just done. There was no coming back from this. No apology, no excuse, no reason that could ever justify it. As the reality of the situation set in, a crushing realization took hold of him. His life, the one he had dreamed with Sophia, was over, and in its place was only emptiness, an emptiness that stretched on forever. The sound of footsteps echoed through the dimly lit corridors of Lawrence prison, sharp and deliberate against the otherwise hushed atmosphere. Ethan Carter's mind was a blur of fractured thoughts, but the one constant in his head, the one thing that persisted with terrifying clarity, was the image of Sophia's face, the way her eyes stared back at him as she lay motionless on the bed, the life drained from her. He hadn't moved from the spot where she fell. He couldn't. The weight of what he'd done paralyzed him. It wasn't just the violence, the rage he'd unleashed, but the irreversible nature of it all. His hands trembled as he sat by her lifeless body, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of his actions. He could still feel the pressure of her neck beneath his fingers, the slight resistance of her struggles, the desperate sound of her breath fighting to escape. But now there was nothing. The stillness was absolute, as if the world itself had frozen in place, leaving Ethan to sit in its emptiness. It was the kind of silence that rattled your bones, that felt as though it could swallow you whole. And that's what Ethan felt, swallowed by the enormity of the choice he had made in his fury. There was no coming back from this, no path forward, no escape from the truth that had settled in his chest like a leaden weight. The cold metal of the visiting room door echoed in his ears as it was slammed open. He didn't even hear the guard's sharp, commanding voice, nor did he see the flurry of movement as prison officers rushed in. All he could do was stare at Sophia, her body untouched, her eyes open in a way that would haunt him forever. "Carter!" The voice was sharp, close to his ear, but it didn't feel real. It was a distant sound, as if it came from miles away. He didn't move. His body was as still as the corpse before him, locked in a trance-like state, incapable of doing anything but reflect on the destruction he'd caused. The officers didn't know what to do at first. They hesitated, their eyes darting from Ethan to the lifeless woman on the floor, unsure of how to process the scene in front of them. There were no words, no immediate questions. Everything about this was wrong. They had seen violence in this prison before. Hell, they had probably witnessed worse. But there was something about this scene that felt more personal, more tragic. Finally, one of the officers approached, speaking with the cold indifference that prison life often birthed. "Carter, get up." It was like a trigger. The words broke the fog around him, and Ethan rose to his feet mechanically, his body stiff as though it were a marionette. The realization of what he'd done hit him in a way that could not be ignored any longer. He looked down at Sophia, his eyes tracing the bruises that had already begun to form on her neck, the marks left by his hands. The hands that had once touched her with tenderness, the hands that had written love letters, had now taken her life. The terror he had felt earlier when he had momentarily lost control of his emotions now made sense in its horrifying finality. As he was escorted away, the prison guards whispered amongst themselves, discussing the details of the crime. "She was his wife, wasn't she?" one guard murmured. "She came in for an intimate visit. What went wrong?" Ethan's thoughts were a tangle of guilt and disbelief. His mind kept flashing back to that moment. The look in Sophia's eyes when she had told him the truth, the pain that had crept into her face when he had recoiled. She had pleaded for him to understand. She had begged him to believe that the love they shared was real, despite her past. But he had been too wrapped up in his own anger, his own shock, to hear her. In the days that followed, Ethan was thrown into solitary confinement. The stark, sterile cell that had once been his refuge now felt suffocating. The silence was overwhelming, and yet it was all he could hear. The worst kind of silence, the one that followed violence, the one that made the enormity of your actions echo in your mind over and over. He lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, seeing nothing but Sophia's face. Her eyes were always there, staring back at him, as if they were accusing him. The guilt twisted in his chest, a constant, unyielding presence that he could not escape. The world outside the prison walls moved on, but Ethan's world had stopped. He had destroyed everything he had dreamed of. He had destroyed her. His mother's face appeared before him in the darkness, her eyes filled with disappointment, the sadness in her gaze burning into his soul. She had always tried to protect him from the worst of the world, tried to shield him from the life of crime he had found himself in. But now, her voice seemed like a distant echo, lost somewhere in the ruins of his actions. His crime was no longer just an act of rage. It was a culmination of every choice he had ever made. He had built a house of lies with Sophia, and now that house was in ruins. and it was he who had brought it crashing down. Ethan's reflections were interrupted only by the occasional visits from the prison staff, brief, cold interactions. A guard came by each day to slide a tray of food under his cell door, but Ethan had no appetite. His hunger, if it could be called that, was for some form of redemption that would never come. He sat in his cell, staring at the walls, but all he could see was her face, the woman he had loved and the woman he had killed. He had no idea what had driven him to it, beyond the white-hot rage that had clouded his mind. In the end, it didn't matter. The act was done. The weeks turned into months, and Ethan's trial loomed on the horizon. He was assigned a public defender, who spoke to him in brief, detached sentences about the proceedings, but Ethan barely heard her. His defense was a hollow thing, built on the premise of temporary insanity, an uncontrollable outburst of rage. But the truth, the real truth, was that he had murdered Sophia not in a moment of madness, but out of fear of losing the illusion he had built in his mind, fear of what her truth meant for the life they had imagined together. When the trial began, the courtroom was filled with reporters, family members, and legal professionals. Sophia's mother, Eleanor, was present, though she could barely bring herself to look at the defendant. The grief she carried was like a living thing, palpable in the way she sat, her body stiff, her eyes swollen from the tears that had never stopped flowing since her daughter's death. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of the crime, the unexpected violence in the visiting room, the sudden shift from tenderness to brutality, the chilling realization that this was no spontaneous act but the result of a long-brewing rage. The defense, in turn, tried to argue that Ethan had acted out
of blind fury, that he had not fully comprehended the reality of Sophia's identity when she confessed. But no argument, no explanation could undo what had been done. Ethan sat in the defendant's chair, his hands trembling in his lap, his gaze fixed on the floor. He had no desire to defend himself. He couldn't. There were no words that could justify his actions. He had betrayed her, hurt her, and killed her. His mind replayed it over and over, but there was nothing he could do to stop the flood of guilt. Nothing could fix what he had broken. The trial ended with the inevitable verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Ethan's world felt like it was unraveling, but it was nothing compared to the weight that had been on his shoulders from the moment he had taken Sophia's life. The gavel struck, and his fate was sealed. Ethan was returned to his cell to await sentencing, but nothing had changed. He was still the man who had murdered the woman he had promised to love. The prison walls, once a symbol of confinement, now felt like the only thing holding him together. In the darkness of his cell, the only thing that remained with him was the echo of Sophia's last words: "I love you." But those words, like everything else, were now lost, vanished into the void he had created. And as the days turned to years, Ethan would be left to carry the weight of his actions with him, the memories of her, the echoes of her love, and the unrelenting pain of knowing he had destroyed it all. What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more Crimes Deep Dives.